On a recent show, we were discussing whether the Queen was a shape-shifting reptile alien. And of course, I said that she wasn't, but that doesn't mean that I don't believe that there are reptoid aliens. So I thought it was fitting to bring on Harry Challenger onto the show today. He has been active in UFO research for over 27 years. He is currently the editor and publisher of the Flying Saucer Review in the UK, and I'm very much looking forward to today's conversation with him. But first, I want to tell you all about these incredible functional mushrooms I've been taking every day. Lion's mane, it's just amazing for the brain, for memory, for boosting focus and concentration. Cordyceps for energy, chaga for the immune, reishi for the sleep, relaxation, detoxification. These mushrooms have changed my life, and I really want to tell you all to go to neurobuddha.com. Go to the site, use the coupon code Enoch20 and save 20%. And I also have to mention these incredible pyramids that they're orgone pyramids. You put them in your place, and I just feel that I have better energy all around me. I love looking at them. They're fantastic. They're made by our dear friend Michelle Hood at Light the Light Pyramids. Go there, check them out. Pyramid technology is absolutely fascinating in how it works. Harry, now that we have you on the show, I have to ask you once and for all, is this conspiracy that David Icke has been talking about for years, that Her Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II, was a shape-shifting reptoid? Is there any truth to that? What do you think?
Well, I've been exposed to it like everybody. And for me, there's literally no case evidence. And really what the science of UFO research and all paranormal research is the case evidence. And what you're looking at is firsthand case evidence, and it's not there. And it also shows very strong leanings towards mythology. And really these kinds of ideas, they power themselves. And because the internet existed, these are like the early days of the internet discussion forums. This thing powered itself, and it created this ultra myth that the finest and highest people in office are actually monsters underneath their skin. Now it's a trope, and it's been used for generations, to describe, I mean, if you think about the Nazis, they said the Jews were the monsters in our society. Nero said the Christians were the monsters in his society. It's just another trope, and we've got to be watching for what purpose could this type of story have? And it's mythology, it's mythos. It's not UFO research, it's not alien research. The people I've listened to, and I've listened to a few from very early days in the 90s when the internet was just getting established, and I would meet people who'd been exposed to this trope, and each would add a little bit to the story, and they'd add a little bit. So one of the ones I heard was a special corridor in Sandringham where you would jump between royal palaces. I heard that one, complete nonsense, but it appeared, and the person was emphatic that they knew someone who saw the Queen in one place in a palace, and then she suddenly appeared in Sandringham. This is mythos, all right? This is not research, and it doesn't have, because we look at convergence when we deal with research. So Flying Saucer Review started in 1954. People started looking for global reports, and they bring them together, and they converge, and they give us a consensus. This is how all sort of early days of science, and sometimes philosophy, brings facts. What we don't have in this is any convergence. We have storytelling. And we will have it in other areas as well. It's the classic one, is Elon Musk an alien? This is a modern one. These are just mythologies, and what they attract are people who don't like doing research. And I'm going to say it. When you challenge these people, what's your source? Now, I come from an alternative medicine background. I come from a background where people who had alternative medicine ideas had to have a source. They had to have data. They had to be able to defend their point of view with information that was solid. And you know what? They did. What we look at now is people who haven't learned that you have to have a discipline. And if someone just says they know someone who knew someone who knew someone, I mean, you're the person who knows someone who had close associations with Her Majesty, and they never saw even a slightest hint of any of this. So the dehumanization corridor is just one example.
And you've met who I'm talking about.
Yes,
and he is a very respectable, very reliable gentleman. And he was in around the palace and around those places 24 hours a day. And I don't think anybody's perfect. Nobody's perfect out there.
Children. Now that's the blood sacrifice. That is a anti-Jewish trope. Now the royals aren't Jewish, but that trope of the blood sacrifice was a medieval trope that Jews drank the blood of Christian children. And what do you look at the conspiracy that the royals gorged themselves on blood of children? Do you see? And then we get into other types of human sacrifice. Sorry, I wouldn't want to interrupt, but it's horrific.
So, yeah, well, these conspiracies, they have been around for a very long time, that people have put them on those in power and places that they try to label them. And this is interesting because the Flying Saucer Review has a very interesting connection to Prince Philip. And Prince Philip was he was very interested in ufology. They were interested in all the stuff that we look into. I mean, they're interested in the esoteric world, the world of UFOs, fascinating materials. But right behind you, there's a book to the corner of your shoulder there. Can you tell the folks at home about that?
Well, this is the book. Now, I worked with Gordon Crichton. He was the man who basically handed me, his picture's just up there. And he was a man who started FSR in 54, 55. He came back from America. He'd been a British Foreign Office diplomat in America, and he came back to the UK. He'd been in Belgium, he'd been in various countries, came back to the UK and was there for the start of FSR from issue 3. And he had the original knowledge of this office that he worked at, where Flying Saucer Review was in, I think it was in Doughty Street, which is a publishing area under Waveney Girvan, who was the Scottish publisher who started the magazine in 54. Now, what we have is very clear information, because I sat with him for many years listening to his recollections, that there were equerries. These are the personal assistants of the royals, and Mountbatten and Prince Philip did bring, they sent equerries with latest reports and information from around the world. And these would be handed and put into the magazines. These were being fed by our own senior royals at the time. Now, no one can ever validate or verify that, but I can tell you that Gordon had been a diplomat for many years. I think he rose to the civilian rank of a colonel. And he was involved in the anti-communist office, so he was a member of MI6. And the leaders of FSR, if you want to call them that, there was the publisher, who was Waveney Girvan, who was the person who published Flying Saucers Have Landed, which was George Adamski's first book. There were people like Lord Dowding coming in with Lord Mountbatten. Lord Dowding was the guy who saved us in the Battle of Britain. He was the one who came up with the defense in 1940 of Britain, which stopped the German invasion. This Lord Dowding was convinced enough to travel around with George Adamski, who came twice. He came in 59 and he came in 63, as far as I remember. And he was definitely, there's an article by a lady called Emily Crew, who's passed on now, she was in her 90s, who was at the flat of Desmond Leslie in London and met Dowding and Lord Mountbatten there. And they were there with Adamski and Desmond Leslie. So you can see straight away, this is cross-fertilization. You've got someone who witnessed Dowding and Mountbatten in the company of George Adamski. You've got equerries from both Lord Mountbatten, who was at the time Admiral of the Fleet. This is a serious man, former Viceroy of India, someone at the core of British society. And we've got Prince Philip, who's from a noble family line all across Europe. You know, these people are coming in and sending their equerries. And then we have this chap who was the Queen's equerry, sounds from another room. Now, what's interesting with him, there's a cluster of mid-1950s official contacts. The only time that we can say, well, people were approached. There's the Holloman encounter, which I think these are all in the spring of 1954 or the late spring. You've got Mr.
Just
James.
so people know that the Holloman encounter that took place, that's pretty much what Close Encounters of the Third Kind is based on.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah. So this is our cultural mythology, but it's based on something. It's not just people coming up with tropes. So this gentleman wrote this book in the 90s, and Gordon Crichton was still alive, and he would have been around these sort of people. So this man was a very senior RAF officer involved in at the time, the nuclear bomber fleet. He was heavily involved in the actual defense of the realm when we didn't have continental ballistic missiles, we had bombers. And this man held that level of security. He was also an equerry to the Queen at the time of her father's death in 52, and then, or 51, 52, I can't remember the exact date. But this gentleman had an encounter with a chap called Mr. Janus, which is in this book. And he talks about his experience of talking to an alien man who seemed to be very assured about who he's talking to. He waits for this guy. He's in a London flat, sitting in a room. Now, Timothy Good talked about this as well in his time, but this was, for me, the official encounters of the mid-50s. This was one of them. Then we've got the Briggs encounter, which is in a place called Broadlands, which was Lord Mountbatten's home. And Mountbatten was away at sea. And we get an alien man who, no UFOs, because Desmond Leslie told this story, maybe tongue-in-cheek more, but we had a chap who was a mystery name called Dan O'Hara, which sounds like a made-up name to me because he's a famous singing man from Galway, Dan O'Hara, I know from the Irish community. And Dan O'Hara did the interview with Briggs, the only one. And he said he met this alien gentleman who walked up. Briggs was an ex-soldier or a Marine, and he was working just as a manual labourer for Lord Mountbatten on Broadlands. The alien walks up and says, "We want to meet Lord Mountbatten." This happens in, again, this period, I think, spring of 54. And the man he says that we're great admirers of the royal family. That's the weird thing that this alien says. And then Briggs gets interviewed by Dan O'Hara, who's 18 at the time, in a pub, and he buttonholes him and finds out the story. So there's no flying saucer there, but there's an alien who talks about wanting to work with the royal family. Now, this was the time of the last nuclear crisis that was genuinely real. So you've got to look at, there was a Chinese threat to, I think it was Taiwan at the time, which is very similar to us now. There was a Russian backing to China, which is happening now. And there was, Eisenhower said, "I see nuclear weapons or as bombs as bullets, and I'm prepared to use them."
And this is the thing, though, with these encounters, though, and as you're mentioning them, I think why Philip was so fascinated by this is that he had a face-to-face encounter. There was a lot of these face-to-face encounters in the 50s. And, you know, we've heard about Eisenhower, which we will discuss. Yes. And we've heard about Philip. But the one thing is, with this whole subject of this reptile aliens and shapeshifters and all that, on the last video, I had talked about how David Icke, who has definitely put this theory out there, he had his famous meeting with Crater Mutwa and the Zulu shaman who told him about the reptilian mythology on Earth, which I believe is real. I really do believe there's enough substantial cases, as I know you're going to get into today, to show that we have a lot of evidence that people have been visited by these folks. But also, he had learned about reptile aliens from Jordan Maxwell on a military base, as well as a developer in Las Vegas that was out at a picnic, and then he encounters this large being that was very intimidating. And their cases are not about, you know, the fact that these reptile aliens were living as humans for long periods of time. And I'm not saying that there's not technology out there that could exist that could change your physiology or allow you to be somewhere as like a shape-shifting, energetic, chimerous structure, like a hologram. I mean, that is entirely possible. We're discussing that now with tactile, kinetic holograms and stuff like that. But in this case that he builds against the royals, I think that the royals are more significant. I think that they have heightened abilities. They come from an ancient bloodline. They do have these various royal houses and training that they have to go through. And they themselves may have enhanced abilities like ESP and stuff like that I've heard. But to say that they're these reptiles that are living there, I think that it's completely untenable, and it sounds ridiculous. And there's the odd flat earther that I'll get on YouTube that will say, "I can't believe you had a globe behind you," or something. But the flat earth theory is another theory I think is put out at the same time. And it's very similar to that, to derail these sorts of things. And I want to talk a little bit about what we know in general about reptilians and what I've been told about them. And maybe you can tell me if you think that this sounds plausible to you, or if it adds up and matches to what you've seen in the various cases you've examined. What I've generally been told is that these reptile-like species are about 6 to 10 meters tall. There are ones that are 3 meters tall. They could be several hundreds of kilos, but they really don't move as fluently as we might think. They use various technologies to move around Earth because of the inertia or the inertial conflict with the gravity on this planet. So they don't come here that often because it's very cumbersome for them to be here. The ones that are 6 to 7 meters tall, they weigh about 1,200 kilograms. They almost have this dinosaur-like appearance. I think they've been here a long time. I think they're one of the oldest occupants of the planet, if we want to look at that. What I've been told is that these days where they come from is in the Orion and the Capella star systems. They have a blackish to grayish brownish skin tone, multiple stomachs, their tongues divide, their empire that they have has leaders that it's more maternal, just like reptile species do with a queen. They have 3 spinal cords that join in the middle of their backs. They have claws and glands in their palms. And it's said that in the Grenada Treaty that supposedly took place in 1954 with a meeting on Earth with Eisenhower, that there were supposedly Greys and reptilians there, and they had a sort of an exchange and deals that they were making. I have heard that the ships that people claim that they have been seen in, that these are more like cigar shaped. I've also been told that they can be very fierce. They have a very strange culture, which I'm sure you're going to get into, that's more aggressive. However, a lot of the information we get about this comes from various underground sources that have been distributed, like what's called the Yellow Book and the Red Book. And if you guys look this up, they're hard to get, but you can get the Yellow Book and the Red Book supposedly came from inside sources. And I've had conversations with people that have been involved with unacknowledged or special access programs that do have knowledge about them. And funny enough, I want to tell you guys that when you discuss this with people who actually know something on the inside, they also say that it's total nonsense that the queen is a shape-shifting reptile alien. I'm telling you, if you talk to anybody who's been involved in these programs, they'll also tell you that that's a ridiculous theory. They won't tell you that, they won't deny that reptile aliens exist. They do say they exist. So I will say that. That's why I believe they do exist, but they will say that that's not the case. Now, what do you think, Harry, from what you've seen in your work? Does any of that sounds like it adds up to their description?
What you described as the giants, I mean, I have had cases where I've talked to people who've had encounters with humanoid giants, but we never actually saw what their features were. And this is the strangest thing. This is the true presentation, and it is hard for people to get their heads around it. There was a case from Yorkshire where a chap was walking down the street, another man was walking with his dog, and a humanoid giant that was probably 4 or 5 meters tall walked down the street between the two of them. Now, wow, we don't know what that was. It could have been one of those reptoids because no one's ever seen what the humanoid giants look like, but they're going to be taller than a truck. And they're going to be, there was another case, I think it was another North of England case where the humanoid was looking over the top of a lorry and he was a giant. And people saw him, or the witnesses saw him, but they had a sort of helmet on, so they couldn't tell what he was. So for me, these are the findings that we know there is a possibility of a race of giants that are here because people do report them, but we don't know who they are. So potentially that would be your reptoid giants. I don't know enough about that. I do know that there's enough evidence to say that the reptoids are seen by ordinary people. So this idea of it's elites and it's people who are strange, high members of society, the people who see reptoids are common everyday people around the world. And that's the reptoid habitat, is in everyday life. And they are, I'm going to start talking about the history of FSR. There was Crichton, who was the person who was my mentor, said that his most important article he ever wrote was A Brief Encounter of the True Nature of UFO Entities. And it was about infrared beings that come out of other domains and come in as soft sort of energy, and they become solid beings. And this was called, he described as Jinn type encounters. And what you find in what he describes, he was a scholar of Arabic, he could read Arabic, and he did talk around the world to people who studied Jinn, which has become a big subject in recent years. I'll just read a few chief characteristics of the Jinn, and they are crossovers to this type of environment. So what the Jinn are described by the Arabs, in my opinion, is are beings that can cross between soft dimensions into our world, who then become solid beings. And the Arabs have known about them and they call them Jinn. But the fact is that any being can come through that way. It's just they group them, they think they're one being. My view is there's multiple species coming through. So I take this guy called Ivan T. Sanderson, who said in the early 70s in his journal Pursuit, if you leave a window open in your bedroom, you'll get bats, you'll get burglars, you'll get birds, you'll get insects, but none of them are related. They're just using the conduit of your window. And for me, the whole idea of beings coming through, which are like smoky, when people see a reptoid come in, and I'll describe in detail some of the descriptions, how they leave the room and how they come in as a smoky being, as a small smoky light. They're non-solid, and then they form into a solid form. That's what a jinn does, in my opinion. So here's some descriptions. In the normal state, they are not visible or to ordinary human sight. They are, however, are capable of materializing and appearing in the physical world, and they can make themselves visible or invisible at will. So this is Gordon writing this in 1983 as his life's work, a summary of what he thinks entities are. They can change shape and appear in any sort of guise, large or small. So there's your giant straight away. They are also able to appear in the guise of animals, which is difficult for us because we're not used to this whole shape-shifting idea. They are inveterate liars. Now, this is Crichton's position on it, which was also a guy called, well, there's a number of writers. There was a guy called Randall James Pugh who wrote about the Dyfed Enigma. He believed this. And there was another guy who was a Greek Orthodox ex-military guy, a naval officer who lived in Glastonbury. I did go and meet him. He believed they were inveterate liars, and they see them as biblical devils. That's what they saw these things as. Again, it's a trope. To me, we're looking at people who were born in the early 1900s. So when I met, I'm trying to remember his name now. When I met him, the other chap who was this former naval officer, who incidentally had met Hitler in 1936. So that shows how old he was. He was about 96 when I visited him, or 95 in Glastonbury. He was convinced that they were all devils, and that was his view. And this was Crichton's view.
You could understand how they would take that, though. I mean, this sounds, the appearance of them sounds like the classical depiction that people think of as devils.
So they are inveterate liars and deceivers, and delight in bamboozling and misleading mankind with all manner of nonsense, which partly is the royal trope. The trope that we're talking about is all manner of nonsense, because it distracts you from an entity which has a habitat, which is traveling into our space and then leaving. That's what they are. They don't necessarily have anything to do with a conspiracy. They are just beings that travel. They have a particular set of traits, and that's where real humanoid research will take you.
Well, it's interesting because you have some legitimate cases that come from very solid sources that you've met and talked to that have encountered these reptile beings, and it hasn't always been pleasant. It sounds very unpleasant. And you know, it's quite interesting. It's quite interesting that a lot of people have said that when we look at the Operation High Jumper, we look at the Admiral Byrd case up in the Antarctica, that a lot of people were saying that he had encountered reptilians and it was all reptilian technology. But actually, when you look at the missing diary of Admiral Byrd, Admiral Richard E. Byrd, and you look at what they encountered up there, he doesn't say that he met reptilians. What he says when you read it is that he met the inhabitants, almost like a multi-dimensional inhabitants of the survivors of Atlantis, or the ones that were going through Agartha, the inner earth. He doesn't talk about the other sides of things, but in New Schwabland, or base 211, I want to get into this case that you mentioned that happened even there in the UK. And it was a sort of a gruesome encounter of one gentleman that went out just to take a pee break, wasn't it?
This was New Year's in '94. If I can just find it, I'll get it up for you for a second. I'll read it out and then you can put up, there we go. So this is a chap called Henry. He actually came in because I do run a clinic, and he came in as a client, and he was very open for the duration of nearly 30 years that he'd met reptoids in Watford. And this would have been New Year's Eve, 1994, about 9 p.m. Now, next to the main ground is a cemetery, which some of my relatives are actually buried in. So I know that cemetery, and there were two men, Henry and his friend, went to relieve themselves on the war memorial, which is pretty appalling, but they were young at the time. and they thought they saw a low flying bright light, which they took to be a police helicopter equipped with a floodlight. Now, the next thing, they find themselves on board a craft, and Henry's watching his friends in passionate clinch with the most beautiful blonde woman he's ever seen. His friend seems to be under trance and stood while the woman, I use the word, serviced him. That's the phrase I'd use. Then as this woman got up, this beautiful woman, she's transformed into a large green lizard, licking its lips with a red tongue. At that point, Henry became hysterical. He returned along with his friend long after, about 8 hours later. Then the celebrations were all over in Watford, even though this was in the early evening when this had happened. Both men had conscious recollection. Henry clearly suffered from PTSD and told everyone he knew in classic Hollywood tradition. I've described this. I remember the chap in the film Them, where the giant ants, and he's talking about seeing them and everyone thinks he's mad. Well, this man has been thought of as mad for the rest of his life because he talked openly about it. And he did use alcohol to keep himself calm. This case history immediately is a seriously damaged life, which is Henry's life, and his friend wasn't much better. And what was a non-consensual sex act with a reptoid. And this is a warning. So that's where I start from. Now,
so this was a humanoid reptoid that was like a reptoid in a human sort of body, that it's not a shapeshifter, but it's a humanoid with reptoid features. Like
it was actually a green lizard-faced being, but it took the form of a blonde woman when it was seducing his friend. So the two of them were taken randomly, as I say, next to the main football ground in the cemetery there. And I know that spot well because I used to visit there. I've been in there hundreds of times myself. So I know it, and I've driven past it probably on a daily basis. So I know that spot.
So what about, there was a case that was quite gruesome about, I believe it was in Africa, wasn't it? The other case that you told me about, there was a...
But this is a really important case because it gets into the depths of what the relationship happens in long term. Now, Cynthia Hind, who was the greatest researcher, looked into a particularly nasty reptoid case, and it was to do with the Civil War or the Bush War from 1964 to December 79, which led to Rhodesia becoming Zimbabwe, the Zimbabwean War of Independence. Now, there were irregular troops, which were called Fire Force, who were dropped behind, into the bush to hunt down patrols. What happened was these chaps, and this is the strangest bit, are sent somewhere, rather like the film Predator, except this was taken well before that film was ever made. And they're dropped in and they have this encounter at night with a landed craft, which initially they just walk past and they all get frightened. And then unfortunately they're sent again a month later. So a lot, and this time they're approached by a being. I stood up and put my Bergen down when a flash of light hit me. It came from an object just above the trees. It was a metallic and elliptical in shape. It was hovering with no noise from it. From a distance about 100 meters, it could be clearly seen. Then it shot away at incredible speed. It was not long afterwards that David started having flashbacks, sudden pictures in his mind of events of something happening. He said, as I finished putting my Bergen on, I was approached by a dwarf in a cloak and a hood. I could not see his face. He said he would take me into the forest where I'd be given something. He then led me away from the rest of the group and did not react at all. So they're all in trance quite clearly, which is kind of common. Let's just go one up there. He took me to a clearing in the forest where the ship was standing. My gaze was drawn to a man, our eyes locked, and some kind of power traveled between us, distorting our physical surroundings. The next thing I recall is standing in an empty room. A woman walked in and asked me where I'd been, here and there. She then said, you must not be found here. It seemed to David that he had met this woman before. So he's having a confused set of memories. Then he remembers being in a hospital ward. And at this point, this is where it gets nasty. So I'll be careful because you have a family audience. At the foot of every bed was a container of unknown substance with body parts of people stacked tightly inside in a horrific form. He then meets his double, which is fairly common, this doppelganger. The double was holding a large key and he pressed it to the side of David's friend's temple and said, it's your double. David's friend looked very shocked by this and said to him, these are his military friends who are now on board a ward on the craft. He recalled coming into contact with a humanoid reptilian being for whom he suffered great pain. It grabbed him by the throat, staring into his eyes and face, into his very soul. With its eyes black and menacing, it was inside me and outside me at the same time. I felt great emptiness and cold from it emotionally. So I've thought long and hard about my treatment. This is what he says to Cynthia Hind. The first thing I thought is, I am alive and others are not. So he thinks other people died on that ship. This is pretty grim stuff. Additional note, I think my view is that they are manipulative. They will say or do whatever they have to do in order to achieve their ends, and they will stop at nothing. They will appear friendly and reassuring 1 minute, and very next minute they're throwing some kind of liquid over my body which burns like acid, and they won't stop no matter how much I plead with them. Only when they finish, they stop. So that was like a really fast talk through. But this guy was vivisected. So if you think what we do to animals, we do vivisection, which many people now are against, and we're trying to change. Well, these humans were having vivisection. They were being dissected. And what was the strangest? Well, they could be dissected and then replaced and put back together. You've got to understand, we're talking about technology from civilizations many, possibly thousands of years ahead of us. And they're able to dismember a human alive, re-put them back together, and then interfere with their minds to the extent that they are no longer capable of defending themselves or even considering that they're like cattle. I mean, this is a human mutilation that was described here. This is a case of human mutilation. These reptoids, this man had seen them over the years, and he felt that this was the strangest part. He met a very fragile, very delicate being that was so delicate and tender, and yet the next minute he's being tortured, because I didn't mention he met this very delicate being that was very feminine. But of course, they're playing with his mind. So that comes into Crichton's thing about this deception. You know, this 1983 article, which is his life's work summarized, he talks about deception. So for me, that's a classic case.
Well, let me jump in there and ask you this. A lot of people have said that these beings could be feeding off a loosh from people, the fear, the worry, and all this emotion that they create in human beings. And you have to ask yourself, why are they doing this? What is the purpose for them? Are they just there to eat humans, or what are they after?
Well, this is the case that we hear from people. I mean, I was very careful because some of these reptoid contactees don't want anything known other than, they hold it private, deeply private. But what you get is a group of beings, and torture is either done, or something worse, which involves forced non-consensual acts, which I can leave to your imagination. The beings seem to be collectively involved, so they have a social structure where they watch in a group individuals being destroyed, basically, in different ways. What's interesting is the psychic overload. So there are a lot of psychic encounters, and this is a huge missing element still in our understanding of UFOs and aliens and other paranormal events. They use overwhelming force, almost like fascists, on people's minds, and they don't seem to care what damage they do, and they don't seem to, it's purely that we are being vivisected by these things, and it shows how defenseless we are because we have this closed dialogue. We have no dialogue on this, and people are totally unprepared. Thankfully, it's relatively rare. I'm not saying many people meet reptoids, and when you talk to these people, they believe they have a connection to the reptoids. If you talk to a reptoid contactee, they'll say, yes, I am part reptoid myself. But I take the view, are they conditioned to become like reptoids from their exposure because of this psychic infiltration? So they start to develop reptoid traits, which are forceful character, very seductive type people who might be quite ruthless if you look at them that way. And I wouldn't want to insult them, but they seem to have taken on the traits. Now they believe it's because they are part of that culture in a reincarnated, animated state. My view is I don't know, but I certainly think they're contaminated by these contacts. And certainly the fact it's a social environment they're drawn into. So my personal view is I take the Nero approach, because I just watched a documentary on Nero last night. Nero did all these things. He mutilated Christians and he wasn't feeding off them. And he burned Christians alive. He fed them to wild animals. He disarticulated them very much like a reptoid would do. And then some people would say, oh, well, Nero must have been a reptoid. And he's considered the 666 Antichrist. When people do all the gematria and all the work on it, it's Nero. So then they were looking at I was watching a fundamentalist video, and they said, well, perhaps he'll reincarnate this Nero entity and they believed it came from, again, another trope, that the super collider would create the connection to hell that would bring Nero through as the new Antichrist at the age he was when he died, which was, I think, 38. Now, this is an example of another trope. But the interesting thing is, Nero wasn't feeding off people's energy. He had a diabolical mind that was culturally able to produce other people's atrocities, which is exactly what the Nazis did, and the Spanish Inquisition and various others. They all used this method of mass psychosis, or whatever that word is. There's a mass psychosis. So I believe they are a culture, these reptoids, which is undergoing mass psychosis. And they actually socially have developed brutality because they are predators of some kind. And that's why humans are so easy to become mass psychosis predators. Let's use that term, a mass psychosis predator, because Nero showed it. He did this to the Christians for 3.5 years. He made it an entertainment. So people would go to the arena, exactly what the reptoids do, sit in a group in a kind of semicircle, and they'd watch Christians being fed to lions, being dismembered. There's worse things which I can't really say because they're too awful. And he wasn't feeding off people's energy. He created a mass psychosis, which I think is to do with societal control. So we're giving these things too much credit. They probably don't suck your energy psychically. They control their society through horror, which, again, you think of the Khmer Rouge, they're another group. They literally impaled people, did horrific things. We see it in Apocalypse Now. They were Montagne guards in Apocalypse Now, but they're entire cultures that become destructive. And this Kali energy, I think we talk about, isn't it? This ancient Indian destruction energy. That's what we're talking about, that's liberated. So we have all these energies that should be balanced. So for me, I don't give them any credit, these reptoids. They're culturally brutal. They're no different than Nero or the Nazis or anyone else. And we just have to understand we're going to meet brutal races. But because we have this complete block on discussion, the entire human race is not culturally ready for the reality of other intelligences. So I go for the point that what we're looking at is dimensional crossing, which is now a culturally accepted idea, even though we don't understand the technology. And we're seeing various different types of entities, one of them being reptoids. One of these Ivan T. Sanderson's open window is the actual reptoids. They come through. These are the snakes, if you like, that came through your window. But they're nothing more than just a species with culture that we don't understand, but I think they're a mass psychosis culture.
And that's a very good way of looking at it. You know, as we move out into space, we're going to encounter all sorts of different races and advanced civilizations, and it's something we have to be prepared for in the future. But I think they have been here a long time. And according to the folks I've talked to that have been involved with the special access or unacknowledged programs, they tell me, they said they really don't come here as often as you think. As I mentioned, it's very hard for them to operate on the Earth's gravity and move around without some sort of technology. I want to say, Harry, mate, it's so great to have you on the show. And I want to have you back again to talk about the Jinn and other interesting subjects. How can people find you? How can they get the Flying Saucer Review?
Well, as fsr.org is our old website, still up, and that's probably the best way. And there's an email, maybe lunula9@aol.com, linula9@aol.com. You could always contact me through that. I mean, the main thing for me is to create global network research and convergence of evidence and data. So we have working models. So everything I've said today is a working model. No one claims they know, but I'm trying to look at it from logic. So I'm trying to do what I call comparative cultural analysis. I'm looking at Nero against the reptoids. He does the same things as the reptoids. Nero is a human, but he does the same things as reptoids. That was my finishing point. I didn't even know I was going there today, but that was it.
It was great. Hey, thank you, mate, so much. Have a great day.
All right. Thank you. Thank
And
you,
to
Johnny.
everybody at home, remember to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends. And we'll talk to you all soon.